All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to dive in.
You know it. And today we're heading to the forests of Central America, the really, really lush, humid forests. It's actually to learn about a specific frog. You ready for this?
Always ready for a good frog story. Hit me.
The Chortis Streamside Frog.
Ooh, I've heard of this one.
Yeah, they're pretty fascinating little creatures. And they're found in, well, specifically Honduras and Nicaragua. But they like these very particular spots in those countries. It's called like the lowland and submontane forests. Have you heard that term before?
Submontane. Yeah. It basically describes those zones that are kind of sandwiched between the lowlands and then the really, really high mountainous regions.
Okay. So they're not quite at the tippy top of the mountains, but they're also not down in the,
Not in the valleys.
yeah, exactly.
No.
And the other thing is they always, always need to be around a flowing stream or river. So a very specific type of habitat that they're adapted to.
Makes sense. Streamside, like the name suggests. They probably rely on that flowing water for all sorts of reasons, breeding, keeping cool, finding food.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this frog was once so common, like people would just see them all the time. But now it's facing some really, really serious challenges.
Yeah, habitat loss, I imagine. It's a familiar story for so many species these days. Development encroaching on their territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Habitat loss is a huge factor. And that's led to this frog being classified as endangered, which is really, really sad. But I do want to kind of start with some of the cooler aspects of this frog because there's some really fascinating stuff about them before we jump into all the, the threats and the doom and gloom and all of that. So I know you've done a lot of research on amphibians. What is it that makes the Chortis Streamside frog so unique?
Well, one of the things that really stands out to me is their reproductive strategy. It's pretty wild.
Okay, all right. Because when I think about frogs, I always think about that classic image of like, eggs in the water.
Tadpole.
Yeah. Then they turn into the little tadpoles, and then eventually you've got a full-grown frog.
Yeah.
Is that not what these frogs do?
So you're describing the typical amphibian life cycle, which is
Yeah.
super common. But these Chortis streamside frogs, they do something called direct development.
Okay, direct development. So what does that even mean?
It means they basically skip the whole tadpole phase. The female lays her eggs, and get this, miniature versions of the adults hatch right out of those eggs.
What? No way. Like fully formed tiny frogs just hopping around?
Exactly. No awkward tadpole stage, no gills, no metamorphosis in the water. They emerge looking like, well, miniature versions of mom and dad.
That is so cool, but why? I mean, what's the evolutionary advantage of skipping that whole tadpole stage?
Well, think about their habitat.
Yeah.
Those fast-flowing streams. Tadpoles are super vulnerable, right? They'd get swept away in a heartbeat in those currents.
Oh, right. That makes sense.
Exactly. So by developing directly into froglets within the egg, they avoid those turbulent waters altogether. It's like a built-in safety mechanism to increase their chances of survival.
That is a really, really smart adaptation. But like we were talking about earlier, they are facing some threats. They're on the endangered species list. So even with these amazing adaptations, there are still things that are really impacting their survival. Can you talk to us a bit more about those threats?
Well, you hit the nail on the head earlier. Habitat loss. It's a huge problem. Deforestation,
Yeah.
for agriculture, logging, development, it's all taking away the forests they need to survive. Their homes are literally being destroyed.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to see. And then I know we've discussed this on previous episodes, but there's also the issue of chytridiomycosis, that fungal disease that's really wreaking havoc on amphibian populations globally.
Right.
How is that impacting the Chortis streamside frog specifically?
It's a major threat to them, unfortunately. This fungus, it attacks their skin, and for amphibians, their skin is everything. They breathe through it,
Okay.
they absorb water through it. So when this fungus infects their skin, it disrupts those vital functions, making them very sick, ultimately leading to death in many cases.
So their skin, which is usually such an asset in this humid environment, becomes a liability when it's infected.
Exactly. It's a tragic irony. And we can't forget about pollution. That's another huge threat to these frogs. Their streams and rivers are becoming increasingly polluted from all sorts of sources. Agricultural runoff, carrying pesticides and fertilizers, industrial waste, even urban runoff, all of it flows into the water, contaminating the very places they need to live and breed.
And like you were saying earlier, they're absorbing that through their skin.
Precisely. So they're not just exposed to it, they're taking it in. It's like a triple whammy. Habitat loss, disease, and pollution, all impacting this frog's survival.
It's Just a lot. But, before we get too deep into that, I do think it's important to also highlight why the Chortis Streamside Frog is so important. Like, what is it about this frog that makes it such a valuable part of its ecosystem? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, for one, they're part of the food web.
All
They
right.
eat insects, which helps keep those populations in check, and in turn, they become food for larger animals like snakes and birds.
So they're keeping the ecosystem balanced, both as predator and prey.
Exactly. And here's another really interesting thing. They're considered bioindicators.
Ooh, okay, bioindicators.
Yeah.
I feel like we've mentioned that term before on the show, but just to remind everyone, what exactly does that mean?
Sure. So a bioindicator is a species that's particularly sensitive to environmental changes. They're like the canaries in the coal mine. And because amphibians, like the Chortis Streamside Frog, have such permeable skin, they're super sensitive to changes in water quality.
So if there's pollution in the water, they'll be the first ones to show signs of stress, illness, or even death.
Exactly. Their decline serves as an early warning system that something's wrong in the environment. And that's why protecting them is about more than just saving a single species. It's about protecting the health of the entire ecosystem and ultimately ourselves.
I like that. They're like tiny little guardians of the ecosystem. Their presence tells us that things are in balance, and their absence is a warning sign that something is off.
That's a great way to put it.
So, given everything that we've talked about, all these challenges that they're facing, what are some of the conservation measures that are being taken or that could be taken to help the Chortis Streamside frog bounce back?
Well, the first and most important step is habitat protection. We need to protect the remaining forests, especially those along the waterways, and restore areas that have been degraded. That means creating protected areas, promoting sustainable forestry practices, and really making sure that development doesn't encroach on these critical habitats.
It sounds like it's all about giving them space, right? Giving them space to live, space to breed, and clean water to thrive in.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of chytridiomycosis. Researchers are working hard to understand this disease better, to find ways to treat infected frogs, and even to develop ways to prevent the spread of the fungus.
So that's like tackling the disease head on, finding ways to either cure it or stop it from spreading in the first place.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about pollution. Addressing pollution from all its sources, agriculture, industry, urban runoff, that's essential. Implementing stricter regulations, promoting sustainable practices, and raising awareness about the impact of our actions on water quality. That's all part of the solution.
So it's a multifaceted approach, right? You have to protect the habitat, fight the disease, and clean up the pollution. It's a lot, but it seems like those are the key things that need to happen if we want to give the Chortis Streamside frog a chance.
It is a lot, but it's doable. It requires collaboration, dedication, and a real commitment to conservation.
Well, I certainly hope that with these efforts, we can help the Chortis Streamside frog bounce back. It's a reminder that even small creatures play a vital role in the ecosystem, and their survival is intertwined with our own.
Absolutely. And if amphibians like the Chortis Streamside frog, these creatures that are so sensitive to environmental changes, are struggling to survive, what does that tell us about the health of the planet that we depend on for our own survival?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but hopefully this has inspired you to learn more about amphibians and the conservation efforts happening in your own area. Even small actions can make a difference.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it was a pleasure. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.